There's a rather common idea that religion and science are fundamentally incompatible due to the role that faith plays in religious belief and just broadly speaking in theistic worldviews. The idea is that science on the one hand demands that we only accept the truth of a proposition or that something exists when we have sufficient evidential support for that thing. Yet on the other hand, a theistic worldview or a religion demands that we accept the existence of God, which, as the belief would go, can only be accepted on faith, and there is no empirical support for this. Thus, we supposedly have an incompatibility between the epistemic demands of science and the role that faith plays in a religion or in a theistic worldview. But in this video, I'm going to demonstrate that actually science too relies on faith. Science makes many assumptions that cannot be demonstrated with empirical evidence. Science cannot prove the truth of these propositions itself. It simply has to assume their truth at the outset of inquiry. Now, the point of this video isn't to suggest that these assumptions are unreasonable or unjustified, or that we shouldn't trust the conclusions that science delivers. The primary goal of the video is just to show that all knowledge rests upon assumptions that we cannot prove empirically. And thus, the idea of science as this objective worldview that has no room for faith whatsoever, or that faith is in some sense incompatible with science, is a complete myth. Now, as I go through the list, you might roll your eyes as I read some of these out and think to yourself, well, it's a bit nitpicky to call that an assumption because it's so basic and trivial. But remember that no matter how pragmatic and useful an assumption is, or no matter how intuitively obvious it seems, it doesn't change the fact that it's a faith-based assumption. It's something that you cannot demonstrate, you cannot verify empirically, yet we just all assume it, and it forms the basis of the rest of our knowledge. Science isn't simply concerned with what's pragmatic and useful. People actually derive pretty strong metaphysical claims from scientific worldviews. For example, the supposed lack of free will in a human being, or the idea that consciousness is a purely physical process. These are examples of pretty widespread accepted metaphysical beliefs from people who heavily draw upon science for their worldview, yet they extend far beyond purely pragmatic science that abstains as far as possible from making claims about the nature of reality. Now, the last comment I'll make before we jump into this list is that I imagine many people think this video is a kind of veiled attempt at religious apologetics. But that's not the case. I'm not actually religious myself, but I think that this is an important topic, especially in an age where physicalist worldviews reign supreme, at least in the academy, and where scientism is pretty undeniably on the rise. I mean, it's a very common trope that all claims need empirical support, and the idea that, oh, well, God cannot exist because you can't empirically verify him. Where's your empirical proof for God? This is undeniably a fairly common thing to hear. And as I noted at the beginning, the idea that science and faith are these diametrically opposed systems of knowledge is also quite common. So I think it's of interest to a lot of people with a lot of different types of beliefs to note that science actually does have a role for faith, and we have to use faith in order to do science in the first place. So anyway, that's enough talk, that's enough intro. Let's jump into this list, let's get through these assumptions, these faith-based assumptions that science makes. So coming in at first on the list, science must assume the existence of an external world. Now, to the uninitiated, this might not seem like an assumption whatsoever. After all, don't we just directly interact with the world? Am I not looking at it right now? How is it an assumption to say that something that I'm just looking at exists? Doesn't science actually investigate and prove the external world via our observations? Well, the reason that the external world is an assumption is because we actually do not directly perceive it whatsoever. Ironically, this is actually perfectly in line with what science itself tells us about perception. On the scientific view, our eyes, our ears, our sense organs take in signals from the external world. In the case of our eyes, this is light waves hitting our retina. For our ears, sound waves, of course, enter our ear canal. And then these signals enter our brain where they're transduced into neural impulses and used to form further representations and models of the external world. So what this means is that our interaction, our observations of the external world are mediated by our sensory data and also our neural activity. The only world that we can access is the world presented to us by the signals that our sense data is taken in, combined with the particular way that our brain has processed that data and formed models of what it takes the world to look like based on them. It definitely naturally seems as though we're sort of sitting inside our head and we're looking outside of our eyes, which are almost like these transparent windows, and we're just simply seeing objective reality exactly as it is. But this is a very useful but false, intuitive way of looking at perception. It's definitely hardwired into our cognitive faculties to think that we are perceiving the world in this direct and mediated way. But it's simply not true. In fact, even before science filled in the particular concrete details of this picture of perception, philosophers had known for centuries or even millennia that we don't actually perceive the world in a direct manner. What we are acquainted with is the appearances of the world, how the world appears to us, our sense data. We're not actually directly acquainted with the world at all. It's completely consistent with our observations of the external world to hold the view known as philosophical idealism, where we say that there is no external world in addition to all of our minds. All that exists as fundamental reality is mind, and there's nothing beyond it. But science makes the faith-based assumption that there is an objective reality external to our mind, such that if all minds, if all perceivers were removed from the universe, there would still be this universe to observe, and that it would have an objective nature, independent of the way that we happen to subjectively perceive it. To really hammer home this point, take the examples of hallucinations and of visual illusions. In the case of a hallucination, you can have an entirely vivid perception of an object existing, when in reality it does not exist. There's a distinction between how things appear to you and how they are in reality. And equally, in the case of visual illusions, we can perceive an object to be a certain way. For instance, if we look at a pencil within a bowl of water or a ruler within a bowl of water at a certain angle, then we may perceive it to have a kind of bend in it and to not be straight. Yet we know that this isn't actually how the object is, it's simply how it appears to us. What this shows is that what we're really accessing is our mind's understanding of reality based on sense impressions. We're not actually accessing or perceiving the external world directly as it objectively is. Thus, it's entirely consistent that there isn't actually anything beyond our mind, our conscious experience of the world. After all, we can never get outside of our mind, of our conscious experience, to check if the world's really there. We're always and necessarily mediated by some kind of perceptive apparatus. This makes the external world a postulate. It's something that we assume exists. It's not something that we know for certain. Alright, next up on the list, this is one of my favourites. I think this topic's fascinating. And this is the assumption made by science that there is a real existence of identity over time in objects and in organisms. Now, in the physical world, all objects, including organisms, including people, are undergoing constant change, both in their external environment and in their internal constitution. Typically, though, we think that each of these objects or people have a sort of an essence, to where even if they undergo numerous physical changes, they're still the same object or the same person in some sense. Now, René Descartes has an interesting example of this with a piece of wax. Now, at first, the piece of wax is solid, and it has a specific shape, it has a specific smell, it has a specific feel to it, it has a specific length. You can list a number of different sensed qualities about the wax. And then imagine we melt the piece of wax until it turns into a kind of gooey liquid. Well, every single one of those sense properties has changed. It has now a different smell, it has a different shape, it would taste different if you tasted it, it looks different, it feels different. Essentially, everything that we could sense about the wax has changed. Yet we still possess an understanding that it is in some sense the same wax that we saw earlier. It's just undergone a change. It isn't now a new, separate piece of wax and the old wax has disappeared from existence and the new wax in its new form has appeared into existence. No, we understand it as one object that has undergone a series of changes, but has retained some kind of essence, despite its physical changes. As an even better example, consider yourself. Now, typically we would think that in some sense we're still the same person at 1 month old as we are at 24 years old. But every single cell, every single atom, every piece of physical matter that comprises you has changed and recycled during this time. Even your visible physical form has entirely changed. You've gone from being a small baby to being a grown human being. And as I mentioned, every single cell in your body is now different. Yet you don't say, oh yeah, that other different person who existed 23 years ago, who wasn't me now but was a different person. No, we recognize that in some sense we have an essence that maintains itself. Even if all our physical attributes are changing, the essence maintains, meaning that Aidan at 1 month old is still the same person in some sense as Aidan at 24 years old. Now, the scientific method relies on this assumption that we make about objects retaining their identity over time actually being correct. Imagine, for example, a scientist, a physicist, is studying gases by observing some gas molecules in a container. Now, the gas molecules are in constant motion. They're colliding with each other, they're colliding with the container. The physicist can use scientific laws like the ideal gas law to predict and explain the behavior of these gas molecules under different conditions. What the scientist is assuming, is presupposing, is that all of the gas molecules that he's studying, even as they undergo changes, even as they undergo changes in conditions, changes in kinetic energy, as they collide and interact with other molecules, he's assuming that they still retain some sort of same identity despite undergoing physical changes. That is to say, rather than holding that throughout every alteration in molecular structure or interaction with other particles, the gas is becoming a new and different gas, with the previous gas ceasing to exist, scientists assume that the gas has a sort of essence that maintains even when they observe the gas particles undergoing changes to their macroscopic properties. It implies that despite the dynamic processes and interactions within the gas, each molecule retains a unity and continuity to its identity. Now, this is of course a philosophical assumption. There's essentially a philosophical framework being used for studying gases, as labeling them as entities that have enduring identities. Scientists might then make statements about the gas at time t, the gas at time t+1, and in each case, it's still supposed to be the same gas, just having undergone changes. Now, in biology, scientists assume that organisms retain their identity as they go through the process of birth, growth, reproduction, and death, despite the physical composition and makeup of these organisms going through radical changes throughout this whole process. For instance, when studying plants, it is assumed that the seedling is then the same organism as the plant that produces flowers and seeds once it is grown later on. Now, this assumption is crucial for the study of a life cycle. It's assumed that it's one organism undergoing an entire life cycle, rather than at every juncture, at every physical change, a new organism replacing the last. The life cycle sort of paradigm in biology instead assumes that the organism at time t has attribute X, and then at time t+1, the organism has attribute Y. The assumption is that we have one organism that retains an essence despite undergoing physical changes. But this is essentially quite problematic on the scientific worldview. On the scientific worldview, all there is that makes a human being is matter. So if all the matter constructing a human being, or any object for that matter, has fundamentally and entirely altered, then in what sense, on this scientific basis, can we claim that one entity retains identity over time? Again, when you're 1 month old, science says that you're undergoing a life cycle and you go through birth, growth, you reproduce, and then you die. Throughout this whole life cycle, science is saying that in some sense you're the same organism. But as we mentioned, every single cell that constitutes you, every single part of your physical makeup has changed. So science is again making a purely faith-based assumption. It's assuming that in some sense it's the same organism, but it can't prove it to be the same organism. Or in fact, if we were to evaluate it through science, all we would see is a constant change of particles and of physical constitution. We wouldn't see any essence or identity. It's not something that science can prove. This, to me, is perhaps the most interesting metaphysical assumption that science makes. It's not so much to do with epistemology, with our senses, with our means of deriving knowledge, but it's quite a potentially significant metaphysical assumption about reality, about organisms. Especially when we keep in mind science's complete inability to actually demonstrate that an organism has some sort of same essence at one point in time compared to another. Alright, next up on the list, the next assumption made by science we're going to talk about is the reliability of our linguistic concepts for accurately representing reality. Now, science, of course, like any domain of knowledge, like any discipline, relies on human concepts as tools for understanding reality, whether that be observer, particle, electron, charge, mass, measurement, matter, space, time. All of these things are essentially linguistic concepts within a mind, and that mind is then using those concepts and assuming that they match up to some sort of reality outside of one's conscious mind. Our concepts actually shape our cognition and our understanding of the world. We don't just get raw sense data when we observe the world. Our sensory experience presents itself to us grouped into concepts. For example, when you look at a table on the floor with objects on it, you immediately separate into desk, table, pen, laptop, floor. Intuitively, your cognition utilizes these concepts to shape your understanding of reality. Now, the point here is that, again, we can never get outside of our own perspective to check that these concepts that we're using in our minds to label reality actually accurately reflect reality and don't mislead us about its fundamental nature. As finite humans who can only use our own subjective experience, science relies on the accuracy of our concepts as tools to understand the universe. Now, there's going to be a point that can be repeated with every one of these assumptions where I can imagine someone might try and suggest that actually we can internally evaluate the accuracy of our concepts. I mean, after all, science is all the time coming up with new concepts, replacing the old ones. And this is true. This is essentially the same way that psychology might update memory and say, okay, well, this memory was false, this one was true. But the point we have to remember is that the critique is a more fundamental epistemological critique than this. Because just like in the case of memory, where to evaluate a memory you need either a different memory or someone else's memory, in the case of our linguistic concepts, we're still using other concepts when we conduct experiments or engage in reasoning that leads us to throw out certain concepts and use others. So whilst this evaluation of our concepts might appear to solve the problem, it is simply just an appearance. We're relying on concepts to adjudicate concepts. So if there was some fundamental problem or misleading way that we categorize reality, then all of it would be rubbish. Okay, so next up on the list is the reliability of our sense data. Science, of course, assumes at pretty much every juncture that the sense data we're using as human beings is reliable. That is to say, our senses are depicting reality to us in a reliable and accurate manner. Again, consider the case of a hallucination, for example. There are times when our senses mislead us about the nature of reality, and those cases are subjectively indistinguishable from when it is supposedly reliably giving us reality. If everything we ever perceived was just radically misleading about the nature of reality, and our senses were just systematically deceiving us about the world, we would never be able to know, because we can never get outside of our particular subjective apparatus for looking at the world. We can never get outside of it to check whether they're reliable. Now, you might think that we can consult with other people, we can compare results. we can compare our experiences of the world at one time with another time in order to try and establish which cases of sense perception are reliable and which aren't. Furthermore, science can actually investigate our sense organs and our brain themselves. So isn't it this something that science can actually investigate and not something that it assumes? But it is 100% a faith-based assumption, because whether you're comparing your sense data with other people to try and establish reliability, or whether you're comparing your current sense experience with a previous sense experience to decide which was correct, or whether you're a scientist who's trying to study the nature of the human senses, you are relying on your sense data fundamentally. So if it was just fundamentally misleading you, then you would never be able to get off the ground with your inquiry. You can only assess the reliability of your sense data by assuming in the first place that it has some degree of reliability. If it was misleading you, then you wouldn't be able to trust the evaluations you make on the basis of your sense data. Thus, this is another faith-based assumption made by science. Scientists have to just assume and have faith in the fact that our senses as human beings reliably depict and report objective reality to us. If they didn't, we would have no way of knowing. Now, another thing you might think is something like, well, I navigate the world every day. I don't just bump into objects that I can't see. I don't fall into ditches that I can't see. So this shows me that the reliable results I'm getting in the world do demonstrate the reliability of my sense data. So it isn't a faith-based assumption. But remember, your experiences of falling in ditches or bumping into objects would be themselves sensory experiences. So what you'd be essentially doing is evaluating the reliability of your sense data by looking at instances of sense data. But this doesn't solve the problem if all of your sense data is fundamentally misleading you about reality. Okay, next up on the list is similar to the last one. It's that the aggregate or the consensus sense experience of many people is superior to my own experience of the world. For instance, if I have a particular observation, but then that contradicts with what a whole load of other scientists observed, then an assumption made by science is that we should trust what the other scientists said and not our own. Now, this is an assumption because just as we have to assume the reliability of our own sense data, to an even greater extent, we have to have faith in the reliability of other people's sense data. After all, we don't even have access to those people's minds. We can't even know for certain that they have minds at all. All that we can have access to is our own conscious experience, our own perceptions. And so when we prioritize what other people observed over our own, we're making a faith-based assumption. We can't empirically verify the accuracy of what they observed any more than we can get outside of our own subjectivity to verify the reliability of our own sense data. Simply an assumption made by faith. Okay, next up on the list, the reliability of our reasoning faculties. Now, this is another presupposition made by science. It's something that's purely faith-based because we cannot evaluate the reliability of our reasoning faculties without using our reasoning faculties. And this makes the whole endeavor circular. If our reasoning faculties were systematically deceiving us, then we wouldn't do ourselves any good by trying to inquire using our reason whether our reason is reliable. We would simply be doomed to perpetual false conclusions. Now, science, of course, uses deductive, abductive, and inductive reasoning, all of which are performed by a human being with fallible capacities for reasoning. And again, we cannot establish the reliability of reason with reason itself. That would be circular. It would be to assume the reliability of the thing that we're trying to test. Now, the reliability of our reasoning faculties is to me one of the most substantial faith-based assumptions that science makes, both because it's entirely universal to all practices of science, and also because it's actually one of the things that we can have some reasonable skepticism about. After all, the scientific picture of the world tells us that we essentially evolved via processes of random mutation, natural selection. And this is essentially where all of our faculties came from, all our organs, including our brain. This means that all of these features we have as human beings, all of these functions, all these capacities, they came about because they were useful for aiding our survival and reproduction, or they were a byproduct of some other feature that was useful for survival and reproduction. Now, of course, this includes our brain and our reasoning faculties that our brain employs. Our reason is dependent on our brain, and our brain was dependent on being reliable for helping us survive and reproduce. A problem arises, however, because usefulness for survival and reproduction and providing accurate insights into objective reality are two very different things, and these two things don't correlate perfectly. You could have beliefs about the world that are very useful for your survival and reproduction, but entirely false about real objective reality. If every conclusion that we ever reach, if every piece of reasoning we ever engage in, is simply chemical processes going on in the brain of an evolved ape-like creature, then what grounds can we have for having a lot of faith and confidence in those reasoning faculties? Our brain might be very good at helping us to survive and reproduce, but this isn't the same thing as being reliable with respect to gaining clear, accurate insight about objective reality. Now, Charles Darwin himself actually riffed on this topic a little bit. In his letter to William Graham, he said, "But then with me the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions to be in such a mind?" Now, the idea here is that we could just be systematically deluded by the impoverished nature of our own reasoning faculties, yet be entirely in the dark about this impoverishment. Now, philosopher Alvin Plantinga actually leverages this as an argument against atheism in quite an interesting manner. I'm not going to detail the argument here, but the basic essence of it is that if we accept evolution without a God existing, then we have no way of evaluating the reliability of our reasoning faculties. We have no grounds for confidence in them, because all we know is that they help us to survive and reproduce, but we don't know that they help us to find the nature of objective reality. But then this makes the whole enterprise rationally self-defeating, because we've accepted evolution in the first place, but then evolution tells us that all our faculties were just the result of evolutionary processes to help us survive and reproduce. And thus, this shakes the confidence we can rationally have in... Okay, so first up on the list is the reliability of our reasoning faculties. Now, this to me is perhaps the most substantial faith-based assumption that science makes, both because it's entirely universal to all scientific disciplines, meaning that any science you ever perform relies on the reliability of the human reasoning faculties. And it's also very substantial because I think among the various assumptions that science makes, this one is the subject of the most interesting philosophical analysis, and also it's the most reasonable one to actually question and doubt, in my opinion, or one of the most reasonable. Similarly to the assumption of reliability of sense data, we have no way of evaluating the accuracy of our reasoning faculties without engaging our reasoning faculties themselves. And this, of course, makes the whole endeavour very circular. If we were being fundamentally misled by our reasoning faculties and systematically or unreliably coming to false conclusions, then we wouldn't be able to evaluate that capacity in any kind of reliable manner. Since we can never get outside of our human reason faculties, we can never properly evaluate their accuracy, and thus it's simply a faith-based assumption that we make at the outset of inquiry when we say, okay, I'm going to trust what rationally seems to me to be correct. I'm going to trust that my internal processes of reasoning are correct. Of course, science engages in deductive, inductive, and abductive reasoning, and so anytime a scientist is going through these reason processes in his brain, he has to trust that he is accurate in doing this. Now, you might think that some truths of reason, like for instance 3 plus 3 equals 6, are just clearly and distinctly correct, as Descartes might put it. You can just intuitively see that they are correct. There's no assumption to be made. But that intuition you get, that sense you have of just identifying a correct process of reason as opposed to a false one, if that process was just entirely misleading you every time, you would have no way of knowing. That judgment faculty you have where your brain just kind of lights up like, yes, 3 plus 3 equals 6, clearly true. That could just be systematically deluding you. Now, obviously, science relies on much more complex uses of reason anyway. So even if we did grant that there are certain basic truths that we can just see the truth of in an intuitive manner, it really wouldn't do much to undermine the fact that this is a faith-based assumption of science, because of course science relies on far more complex reasoning. Now, in terms of actually casting positive reason to doubt the reliability of our reasoning faculties, I think that there are some fair considerations that we can discuss. The scientific picture of the world tells us that we, and all of our capacities, organs, functions, they all came about via natural selection and random mutation. Now, this means that they're essentially optimized for survival and reproduction. They're things that gave us a benefit with respect to survival and reproduction, or they were a byproduct of something else, some other capacity that helped us to survive and reproduce. Now, philosopher Alvin Plantinga actually leverages this fact into a very interesting argument against the conjunction of evolution and atheist worldviews. Now, he doesn't deny evolution, but he argues that we're rationally compelled to accept theism and evolution and not atheism and evolution. Evolution solely prioritizes survival and reproduction. It doesn't prioritize true beliefs in any intrinsic sense. The set of beliefs that are useful for survival and reproduction and the set of objectively true beliefs about reality are not always one and the same. That's of course not to say that evolution doesn't predict that we would never come to true conclusions. It's simply to say that it doesn't necessarily prioritize true conclusions. And what this means is that the reliability of our reasoning faculties, given evolution being true, is either low or inscrutable, meaning we don't really know how reliable our reasoning faculties are. Maybe we're being, in some systematic sense, deluded about reality in a way that's simply very useful for us. But then this undermines our belief in the conjunction of atheism and evolution in the first place. Since we relied on our reasoning faculties to accept evolution and atheism, well then evolution tells us that we don't really have any grounds for trusting those reasoning faculties. If evolution tells us that we can't rationally know how reliable our reasoning faculties are for giving us objectively true answers, then how can we know that evolution is true in the first place? It's telling us that we cannot really reliably trust our reasoning faculties because our reasoning faculties just help us to survive and reproduce, which isn't necessarily the same as objective truth. Yet we are trying to establish an objective truth, namely the conjunction of evolution and atheism, which relies on those reasoning faculties that we just undermined the reliability of. But this raises a problem because we used these cognitive faculties of reason that we've just called into question the reliability of to accept evolution in the first place. If evolution gives us grounds to believe that our reasoning faculties might quite likely not be reliable in providing truth about objective reality, well then that undermines the epistemic foundation we have for believing in evolution in the first place. Since, of course, we used our reasoning faculties in order to come to the conclusion of evolution in the first place, but then as a result of evolution, we have to doubt the reliability of those reasoning faculties. Now, Alvin Plantinga's solution isn't to deny evolution by natural selection, it's to say that God exists and God directed the evolutionary process in order to give us reliable cognitive capacities for gaining true beliefs about the world. Now, I'm not sure I stand on that argument, but it's definitely interesting and shows that the situation, the philosophical debate, is a lot more complex than simply, religion bad and faith-based, science objective, and just gives us this objective knowledge about reality and no faith involved whatsoever. Actually, you have to just make the leap of faith that these reasoning processes you're engaging in are reliable somehow, and the worldview that science gives to us, namely naturalism and evolution, call into question those very faculties. We're essentially evolved monkey-like creatures on this worldview. We exist, our capacities exist for survival and reproduction. Not the same as coming to objective truth. Before we move on, I'll also note that David Hume has a fascinating skeptical argument against the reliability of reason for coming to conclusions that we can have any confidence in whatsoever. But I'm not going to go over this in this video because I think I've already talked enough about this particular point, but I'll link a video about it in the description so that you can watch and learn about it if you're interested. Alright, the next faith-based assumption that science makes is the principle of induction. Now, essentially, the principle of induction states that the future will resemble the past, such that any observations of laws that we've made previously will continue to hold under similar conditions in the future. For example, we assume that tomorrow water will still boil at 100 degrees because we've observed it boiling at 100 degrees so many times in the past. We've identified some sort of law, some sort of pattern, and we assume that this will continue to operate in a consistent manner into the future. Now, nothing about the fact that water has boiled at 100 degrees every single time we've witnessed it boil in the past indicates, logically speaking, that it should do so in the future. You cannot logically derive the statement, water will boil tomorrow at 100 degrees, from the premises that water has boiled every single time we've observed at 100 degrees. Now, you might say something like, well, throughout history, we have this long line of watching this law continue to operate where water boils at 100 degrees, day in, day out, again and again and again. So based on that, that really shows, that proves that it's not going to suddenly change tomorrow, because every time in the past it's held constant. We've watched it hold constant for hundreds of years. But this again fundamentally assumes that the future will resemble the past. That is the thing in question. Just because water has always boiled at 100 degrees in the past doesn't mean that tomorrow that won't suddenly change. Now, science presupposes regularities in nature. It presupposes the principle of induction because it relies on prediction, essentially. Science makes observations and then uses those observations to make predictions about what will happen in the future. But if the future would not resemble the past, if a given observed pattern would not continue to pertain into the future, or if a given law would just cease to carry on working at a given moment, then this would render any prediction obsolete. Science cannot prove that the future will resemble the past. It has to assume it to be the case in order to build its theories, build its models, and make predictions. For example, when a scientist conducts an experiment and observes a certain phenomenon under specific conditions, they assume that under similar conditions in the future, the same phenomenon will occur. This assumption allows scientists to make predictions, to generalize from specific instances to more broad principles, and to formulate theories about the world, how the world works. So to summarize, science makes the assumption on faith that the future will resemble the past, but this cannot be demonstrated through deductive reasoning. It doesn't logically imply from past observations that those observations would continue into the future. And it's also not something that we can demonstrate from observation. Just because we've witnessed observations hold day after day in the past doesn't mean that they'll continue to do so in the future. Suggesting that it would be to assume that the future resembles the past. Alright, moving on from induction. Science assumes that we can make reliable inferences from disjointed perceptions. Now, scientists all the time offer overarching theories or principles to account for partial observations of phenomenon. For instance, the inference of a planet's orbit around the sun is based on partial observations of its position at the sky at different times. We never directly see a planet entirely orbit the sun. We see it at different positions in the sky at different times, and scientists assume from these partial observations that it has orbited the sun. This is never something that we can know certainly. Scientists assume that there's reliability, that there's validity to making these inferences based on disjointed perceptions of a thing. So the next assumption that science makes that cannot be proven by science is the reliability of human memory. Now, anytime we're conducting an experiment or making an observation and then later reporting on it or deriving conclusions from it or using it to support a hypothesis, even if it's just seconds later, we're relying on our memory in order to report what we saw. You have to actually recollect the observation you made, even if it's literally 2 seconds after you made it. Now, we can never be sure that we haven't just been deceived by a false memory when we're making these recollections. What if, again, human memory is just fundamentally flawed and just tricks us every time we use it. Science has to assume at the outset that memory isn't doing this to us and that we can rely on our memories of observations or experiments that we conducted. Now again, you might cite psychology as an example of when science can prove or disprove or provide evidence for the reliability of human memory. But once again, this is insufficient and it misses the deep fundamental epistemological point that's being made by a skeptic here. That sort of science would itself rely on human memory, so all it can ever hope to achieve is testing that one person's memory doesn't contradict with another person's memory. Namely, if researchers were testing participants' memory with some sort of experiment, well, whatever conclusion the scientists derive from this experiment, they have relied on their memory in order to derive those results. So all they can ever prove is, for example, that 20 researchers had a contradictory memory compared to the person being tested. The researchers conducted the test, they used their memory when conducting the test to derive the results. And so again, they're relying on their memory. They're assuming that their memory is correct in order to establish that the participant's memory was false or true, and then derive conclusions about the nature and utility of human memory. But if broadly and universally speaking, human memory just always deceived us in some really radical fundamental sense, then the researchers' memory that they used to establish the conclusions would be completely undermined. We can never rule out that this isn't the case. Again, since all our knowledge relies on our use of memory, we can never get outside of this perspective in order to check whether the memories are reliable or not. And so science helps itself to the faith-based assumption that human memory is reliable and can be trusted. So next up on the list of assumptions is the theoretical virtues that science relies on in abductive reasoning. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, it will take a little bit of explication. Alright, next up on the list of things that science presupposes are the theoretical virtues which are employed in abductive reasoning, or inference to the best explanation. Now this will take a bit of explication for those who aren't familiar with this already, but essentially in science there are many occasions where theory is underdetermined by evidence. Now what this means is, you have a variety of competing theories. All of them explain the evidence in an adequate manner, and you have to select between these competing theories, but the evidence alone does not determine which is correct, because they all explain the evidence. And so, one of the techniques that we move to then is what's called abductive reasoning, inference to the best explanation. So in order to judge competing theories that all are identical with respect to explaining a set of data, what we do is we use criteria such as simplicity. Now, simplicity is similar to Occam's razor, which you might have heard of. It essentially says that we shouldn't make unnecessary assumptions when we're explaining reality. So if one theory, for example, explains the reality with positing one entity, for example, it makes one assumption, it posits this one kind of entity, and we can explain all of the data from this. Well, that theory is to be preferred to another theory that posits two assumptions, two types of entities, for instance. The reason for this is quite intuitive. I mean, it's hard to really give, a complete proof of why one is more likely to be true, but intuitively we can see, well, if one of them is assuming two things and one is assuming one and they're explaining the same amount, well, we're more likely to be free from error if we just stick with the one assumption. But the principle that we should prefer simpler theories, all else being equal, is not something that can be supported empirically or evidentially in any manner. You can't conduct any scientific experiments to tell you that you should prefer theories with fewer assumptions. It's simply a philosophical principle, and thus there are assumptions science makes once again that it cannot itself demonstrate. Simplicity isn't the only explanatory virtue, but it's the one I'm going to use as an example to make the discussion a bit more simple. Okay, the next assumption that science makes is the reality of the past. Science assumes that the past is real and it exists, but all we ever perceive is the present. We never have any direct access to past events, and you might think that you know of them because of your memory, But all a memory is an experience in the present moment, in which you undergo some sort of imaginative experience, perhaps mental imagery of some past event, supposedly past event, and you have the belief that that event happened in the past. But you can never prove that there really was a past event and that you aren't just having some sort of hallucination or delusion. You might really strongly and intuitively feel like there was this past where X, Y, and Z happened, but all you actually are accessing is the present, and you're having this belief that something was happening in the past, but you don't know that that's reliable, you don't know that it's true. All you ever have is your memory. Now, of course, science relies on this because it tries to establish causal relationships between past events and present phenomena. Some people might roll their eyes at calling this a faith-based assumption, but it really is. No matter how intuitive and how natural and how obvious seeming a faith-based assumption is, if we cannot demonstrate it, if we can't provide scientific support for it, well then it's simply an assumption. It's something that we take as on faith at the beginning of inquiry and we cannot actually prove. Alright, next up is the assumption of the uniformity of nature. Now essentially this is the assumption that the principles governing the natural world do not arbitrarily change over time or change from one location to another. For example, if an experiment is conducted under specific conditions, scientists will assume that conducting the experiment elsewhere and at a different time will yield comparable results, assuming all of the relevant factors have been accounted for. This assumption of the uniformity of nature allows scientists to make predictions based on past observations. If the laws of nature are consistent, then patterns observed in one set of circumstances can be expected to apply in similar situations. This predictability is fundamental to the scientific method, allowing for the formulation of hypotheses and the testing of theories. Now, the uniformity assumption not only applies across space, but also across time. When scientists are investigating the past or predicting about the future, again, they assume that the same laws of nature will hold. Alright, so last few, we're going to get through them quickly. So next up is the intelligibility of reality. This is the assumption that the world, reality, is such that it can be made sense of by the human cognitive faculties. Now this really relates to a whole host of assumptions, some of which we've already covered, but essentially it's the idea that reality can be understood through systematic rational inquiry. There's order in nature, the patterns we observe are consistent, the mathematical models that we use to describe reality assume that their reality itself holds up to these mathematical relationships, and that these mathematical relationships between entities really exist. Next up that I want to discuss is the assumption science makes that reality is dualistic. Now what I mean by this is essentially the distinction that John Locke made between primary and secondary qualities of objects. Now I'll illustrate this if you're unfamiliar. Now essentially what science does is it differentiates these primary and secondary qualities. So primary qualities are supposed to be the qualities that objects really have objectively, independent of any observation. Secondary qualities, on the other hand, are supposed to be qualities that we impose on objects via our subjective perception. So the sorts of ones that would fit into the primary quality list would be the size of an object, the mass of an object, the shape of an object. These sorts of things that are supposed to be objective and exist in the object independent of how we're perceiving it. But on the other hand, the thoughts and the emotions we have whilst perceiving the object, the colour of the object, the smell of the object, whether the object is pleasing to us or painful, the heat or the cold of it, all these sorts of things are said on the scientific worldview to actually be features of how we're perceiving the world and not the external world ourselves. But the reality that we're actually presented with, or that we're acquainted with, is a rich, unified conscious experience that embodies all of these qualities. So it is fundamentally an assumption to start demarcating and splitting up these into, okay, these ones exist in the external world, these ones are just features of our mind. Because again, we cannot directly experience the true nature of the external world as a thing in itself, as it exists independent of the way we perceive it. So to make this sort of distinction is a fundamental assumption. We could perfectly coherently just stick with the unified whole of conscious experience and say, no, there aren't these distinctions in reality. Those distinctions are merely artificial. What there is my unified perception, my thoughts, my emotions, the touch, the smell, the color, the size, the weight. All these things are features of concrete reality. Why would I abstract from this concrete experience that I have and via these experiences pick out things that I call observations and say, okay, well, I'm going to explain reality in terms of these abstractions that I've derived. You could, in perfectly coherent metaphysical terms, just stick with your initial reality and just say, this is reality, and it's a mistake to abstract from reality and come up with ideas like molecules, mathematical constructs, and then try and explain reality in terms of these abstractions and say, well, reality is comprised of simply molecules, atoms, particles, and everything else is a derivative. It's a perfectly coherent worldview to question, why would I abstract from my conscious experience certain... It's a perfectly coherent way to think of reality to question, why would I abstract from my conscious experience and start taking out pieces and labeling them as, okay, it's a perfectly coherent worldview to question, okay, why would I abstract from my conscious reality, my total conscious experience, and start eliminating the desires, the pleasures, which requires labeling these things in the first place. So abstracting away from the color, the touch, the taste, the desires, the pleasures, the emotions, the thoughts, and just abstract it down to a particular observation of shape, size, and then perhaps interact with this further via some sort of instrument and start to pick out, okay, I'm going to call this thing a molecule, this thing a chemical, this thing a particle, whatever scientific entity we might be talking about. And then we essentially try and explain the totality of our initial reality, which consists of desires, pleasures, thoughts, feelings, emotions, sensory experiences, colors. Why would we try and explain all of these things that were initially presented to us in terms of something that we've merely abstracted from this entire picture? Now, what I'm referring to here is how essentially the way science works is we abstract from conscious experiences. Again, any scientific experiment is reliant upon conscious experience. So we abstract things that we call molecules or atoms from our conscious experience after we've eliminated most of the richness of it. And then we try and explain conscious experience, emotions, colors in these terms, in terms of atoms and molecules. And we say that this is fundamental reality. Reality is fundamentally just atoms and particles bumping into one another and interacting in various ways. But remember where we got this picture, these ideas of atoms and molecules from in the first place. Now, my point isn't to try and refute this worldview, although I think it's certainly a good challenge. The point rather is to just show the origin of these sorts of scientific ideas and to show that we are making assumptions in the process, because initially what we were presented with was a rich array of conscious experiences, and then we started splitting them up and defining different pieces into different categories, and then eliminating a load of those categories as kind of illusions of the mind, the ways we're perceiving the world and not the world itself. And then once we've whittled it down to what we call scientific entities, to kind of consistent patterns of observation, maybe via an instrument even further away from our initial reality. And then we try and explain the totality we began with in these pure, concise, abstracted terms. That relies on a whole host of assumptions. It's a dualistic view of splitting reality into the world in here in my mind and the world out there, the external world. Some things are in my mind, some things are actually out there in the world as well. Philosopher A.N. Whitehead actually challenges this idea. He calls it the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, where we take abstractions like scientific entities and treat them as concrete reality, when actually they were secondary. They were derivatives from initial concrete reality, which was the initial organic whole of reality, which is consists in perceptions, emotions, thoughts, the whole lot, not just the strict observation of a particular pattern. I'm aware that that portion of the video was a little bit rambly, but hopefully you get the general gist. Okay, so the next assumption we're going to go over very briefly and not in really any detail, even though you could go into detail, but I'm not a mathematician, so I'm not going to. So science, of course, relies upon mathematics, and it also relies on logic. Those two are very intertwined disciplines. The relationship between mathematics and logic is the subject of philosophical inquiry. It's not something I'm going to discuss in this video. But essentially, since science relies on both of these disciplines, well, both of these disciplines have axiomatic assumptions. And so science, by extension, inherits all of these assumptions too. Now, you can question the basic axioms of mathematics. In fact, there's different models of mathematics. There's different mathematical systems based on different axioms. I don't want to make this video even longer than it already is by going into detail, especially on something that is vastly outside of my area of knowledge, but it's uncontroversial that mathematics and logic do rely on these assumptions that they cannot themselves justify. It's also uncontroversial that science relies on them, and so these have to be said to be faith-based assumptions of science. If science is going to not simply use mathematics and logic as internal systems, as kind of like closed systems where we don't try and apply them to external reality, we just derive internal truths like, okay, well, within the system we've constructed, 2 + 2 = 4, but that has no truth beyond the system. It's simply a construct of the system. No, this isn't what science does. Science actually uses these systems to make claims about reality. And not only that, but science claims that reality itself follows certain mathematical structures. These structures really exist independent of us. They really exist out there in reality. So, given that this is the case, I mean, science is relying on the basic axioms of mathematics and also relying on it applying out there in the universe. So it is a substantial assumption that science is making. It can be called a faith-based assumption. Now, lastly, there's the assumption that other minds exist. All we ever access is our own mind, yet science presupposes, it assumes that there are other minds, that other human beings that we observe do have minds, which we cannot observe. We can't observe the mind of another human being. We might be able to see their brain, but this still is dependent on our own conscious experience. We never directly perceive our brain, as we went over earlier in the video. We simply assume that their mind works in a same or similar way to our own.